As head of the Department of Art History and Cultural Practices at the University of Manchester, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor CraigClunas, a world-renowned expert on Chinese art, Professor Emeritus of the History of Art at the University of Oxford, and Honorary Fellow of Trinity College. He'll be talking to us today about the modernity of Chinese art in the early 20th century. We were hoping to welcome Professor Clunas to Manchester earlier this year as visiting Pilkington Professor. Events prevented that, but we're honoured and delighted that he's generously recorded this lecture for us. Before we listen to his lecture, I'd like to say a few words about his distinguished career. Professor Clunas graduated with a major in Chinese Studies at the University of Cambridge, and afterwards went on to the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where he wrote his PhD dissertation. He's worked in a number of institutions. For 15 years, he worked as a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where he was responsible for the installation of new Chinese galleries. In 1994, he moved to the University of Sussex, becoming Professor of History of Art in 1997. And in 2003, he returned to SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he was the Percival David Professor of Chinese and East Asian Art from 2004. He then moved to Oxford, where he held the Chair of History of Art from 2007 to 2018, the first scholar of Asian art to do so. Much of Professor Clunas's work concentrates on the Ming period, between the 14th and 17th centuries, and he also has interests in the art of 20th century and contemporary China. He's the author of numerous periodicals and books: Art in China from 1997 in the Oxford History of Art series, with the second edition published in 2009. And other books include Superfluous Things, Material Culture and Social Status in Early Modern China from 1991, Pictures and Visuality in Early Modern China, 1997, Empire of Great Brightness, Visual and Material Cultures of Ming China from 2007, this last based on his 2004 Slade Lectures, and Screen of Kings, Art and Royal Power in Ming China from 2013. And I've only cited some of them. Several of these books have been translated into Chinese, Japanese and Korean. And in 2014, he co-curated the exhibition Ming, 50 Years That Changed China at the British Museum. His most recent book is Chinese Painting and Its Audiences, published by Princeton University Press in 2017. And he's currently researching the transnational history of Chinese art in the 20th century. In addition, he's known for his contributions to radio programs, including In Our Time with Melvyn Bragg, and A History of the World in 100 Objects with Neil McGregor. So, with enormous thanks to Professor Clunas for his generosity and his patience, I will hand over to him for the modernity of Chinese art in the early 20th century.
My sincere thanks to the University of Manchester for the invitation to give this lecture, and I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the OCAT Institute in Beijing for inviting me in 2019 to give a series of lectures which started me thinking about some of the issues I want to talk about now. Towards the end of the year 1910, as China's last imperial dynasty neared its downfall, though I think it's important to remember that almost no one at the time saw this major event coming, Jin Shaocheng again visited London, a city where he had spent 3 years as a student from 1902 to 1905. In those intervening 5 years, Jin had become a significant figure in the reform of China's prison system, and he was in Britain in the course of a world tour following his attendance at a conference on penal reform held in Washington. He visited numerous countries between January 1910 and May 1911, the period covered by an account which takes its name from this fact, a diary of a voyage through 18 nations. Jin arrived in London for the second time on the 7th of November 1910, remarking that it hadn't changed much, a fact he put down principally to the conservative English character. He made a sentimental journey to South London to look at his old lodgings and was disappointed to find all the people he knew in the area had moved on. He ate in an Italian restaurant. He attended the trial of a woman accused of breaking windows as part of the campaign for female suffrage. He remarks on the thick fog, the ultimate cliché of the London of King Edward VII and Sherlock Holmes. But he also had time to indulge his considerable cultural interests in the visual arts. He was, after all, a man already acquiring a significant reputation as a painter. Indeed, the very day after he arrived, he went to a lecture at the Photographic Society on the topic of the relationship between photography and art. He took his own camera to London Zoo, regretting in the diary that the weather was too overcast for the pictures to turn out well. Then on the morning of 27th November 1910, he went in the company of a Chinese friend to visit what he describes as the oil painting gallery, of which he remarks, "There are some worth several £100,000 each. Oil painting in the Western method has indeed opened up realms unknown in Chinese painting." Now, much as I cherish the idea of this late imperial Chinese intellectual visiting the famous Manet and Post-Impressionist show organized by Roger Fry, and the dates match, and he could have seen it, it is probably necessary rather to conclude that he was instead in the National Gallery. The reference to the huge value of the works on display make this a near certainty. Jin Shaocheng moved on from London to Paris, where again he did a mix of the traditional tourist sites, Napoleon's tomb, the Eiffel Tower, and the new spectacles of modernity, watching a film of the infamous boxing match in which the black champion Jack Johnson beat the Great White Hope James J. Jeffries, sparking a round of racist violence across the United States, violence which Jin describes in his diary as barbaric behavior. On the afternoon of the 21st December, he went again to an oil painting gallery, leaving us this time a much longer and more thoughtful account of his impressions. He has this to say: "It's a space for painting competitions and a gallery for new oil painting. I calculate there are 400 oil paintings and 40 watercolors, all painted by the famous hands of the 19th century. New painting takes an ever more placid and remote path, unlike the close fineness of former oil painting, and has turned towards a similarity with the painting of China. In Chinese painting before the Southern Song, there was much use of fine brushwork, but after the Xuanhe era, that's about 1100, gradually they valued expression, leaving behind outward appearance and grasping the spirit, this being the supreme command in the matter of painting. Nowadays, when people see the workmanship and movement in the oil painting of Westerners and defame the painting of China, this is a particularly bigoted view." Now, it seems most likely that the gallery which inspired in Jin Shaocheng these thoughts about the similarities between recent Western art and Chinese painting was the Musée du Luxembourg, France's principal state gallery of modern painting, where in 1897, and not without controversy, the work of Impressionists and even Cézanne had finally been allowed limited entrance to the artistic canon. The phrase which he uses to typify this modern style, danyuan, translated here by me as placid and remote, is the very same term which had been used in the course of an Italian tour in 1904 by the major politician and writer Kang Youwei to typify negatively the Chinese literati painting of the past 500 years. For Kang, it summed up what Chinese painting sadly was, and what Western painting of the Renaissance canon, which he so much admired, triumphantly was not. Yet here, Jin Shaocheng is happy to apply it to the new painting he is appraising in Paris. Here, Danyuan is a term used to bring Western and Chinese together, rather than to push them forever apart. The bigoted view Jin condemns, far from being one solely held by Western observers, is just as likely one he ascribes to Chinese critics of Chinese painting, people like Kang Youwei, who were at this precise point vocal in condemnation of the art of the Ming and Qing past. Similarity was clearly playing on Jin Shaocheng's mind, since he makes the same point again of an art exhibition which he saw in Amsterdam on the 29th of December 1910, remarking of the oil painting gallery there that there were many new paintings rather close to the Chinese manner. After an extensive tour through southern Europe and on into the Ottoman Empire, Jin was back in Paris in March 1911, and on the 25th of that month he was again in what he describes as an oil painting competition. It seems likely, given the congruence of dates, that this was the annual exhibition of the International Society of Sculptors, Painters and Gravers, at this point under the presidency of Auguste Rodin. A review of the exhibition in the Burlington magazine gives us some sense of what Jin Shaocheng might have seen, although only one work is named with enough specificity for it to be identified today. This is Before the Sunlit Door by Henri Martin. But if we don't know the exact paintings Jin Shaocheng saw, we can at least identify the painters who exhibited in the 1911 International Society show. There was work by Charles Coté and by the Canadian artist James Wilson Morris, among others, all men who, while they might not be in the first tier of the canon today, were successful and self-consciously modern artists of their time. One characteristic and a telling comparison struck Jin Shaocheng in recording his thoughts on this exhibition in his diary. Quote, "The new ones were all distinguished by rough branches and large leaves, extremely blurred and indistinct, like the school of Bada Shanren or the monk Shi Tao, quite a change from the former fine and regular manner." This contrast of new French art with the fine and regular manner of older work, and its comparison to named artists of the Chinese tradition, is rather striking. And it's telling that it is the 17th century artists Bada Shanren and Shi Tao who provide Jin Shaocheng with a point of familiar reference. These two artists, Shi Tao in particular, were gaining hugely in popularity at this point. Jin had both collected his work and himself painted at least one landscape after Shi Tao by this stage in his career. Now, Jin's point that modern European art is getting more like Chinese is strikingly close to the kind of views being expressed at this point by certain Western writers, like Herbert Giles, author in 1905 of An Introduction to the History of Chinese Pictorial Art, and even more by the poet and British Museum curator Lawrence Binyon. Jin's second visit to Europe and his remarks on the growing similarity of French and Chinese painting coincide exactly with the period when Binyon was writing, in his hugely popular book, The Flight of the Dragon, quote, "The theory that art is above all things imitative and representative no longer holds the field with thinking minds." Central to Binyon's reading of the non-mimetic nature of Chinese art as praiseworthy was his engagement, very much at second hand, with a text originally written in China in the 5th century. This is the 6 laws or 6 canons or 6 elements of Xiehe, and the fact that there's no agreed English translation even of the name for them is significant. These were 6 criteria which the ideally successful painter ought, in Xiehe's opinion, to command fully. Empirically, these 6 formulae, each of 4 characters, have been meaningful in writing about art for many centuries and remain so. Today, certainly, a very high percentage of those people in the Chinese-speaking world who take an interest in the visual arts can recite the short text by heart. Now, I'd argue that a correct or accurate or even worse, literal translation of the 6 laws into English is by now an unreasonable aspiration. But for those coming new to the subject, it might be helpful to know that probably the translation most often encountered by English-speaking students is a modified version of that done by James Acker, which reads, "What are these 6 elements? First, spirit resonance, which means vitality. Second, bone method, which is a way of using the brush. Third, correspondence to the object, which means the depicting of forms. Fourth, suitability to type, which has to do with the laying on of colors. Fifth, division and planning, that is, placing and arrangement. Sixth, transmission by copying, that is to say, the copying of models." Now, the first translation of the 6 laws into any foreign language was done into German in 1897, but this remained buried in the decent obscurity of a scholarly Orientalist pamphlet. The first English version, seized upon by Lawrence Binyon in 1904 as the key to understanding Chinese painting, appeared in the writings of the transnational Japanese cultural star Okakura Kakuzo, and was published in his 1903 volume, written in English, Ideals of the East. In a much cited passage, Okakura has this to say: "Shakaku in the 5th century lays down 6 canons of pictorial art, in which the idea of the depicting of nature falls into a 3rd place, subservient to 2 other main principles. The first of these is the life movement of the spirit through the rhythm of things. For art is to him the great mood of the universe, moving hither and thither amidst those harmonic laws of matter which are rhythm." Now, I don't want to go now into the ramifications of Okakura's translation of the Chinese phrase qi yun sheng dong as the life movement of the spirit through the rhythm of things, only to stress that it was made in Calcutta, and it owes a huge amount, quite how much is controversial, to the ideas of the Irish convert to Hinduism, Margaret Elizabeth Noble, or Sister Nivedita. It is itself a transnational textual artifact, a Chinese text refracted by an Anglophone Japanese author through multiple lenses, which include, but aren't restricted to, the thought of Herbert Spencer and Walter Pater, the poetry of the Bengali Renaissance, and the Hindu theology of the globally popular sage Swami Vivekananda. The reception of this transnational textual artifact in the decade after 1903 is further conditioned for someone like Binyon by the huge popularity of the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who drew large crowds to his London lectures in which the concept of élan vital, or vital force, was a central idea. This is the context in which we need to understand the parallel trajectories of Jin Shaocheng and Lawrence Binyon, in both seeing modern Western art as somehow more like Chinese. But the parallelism is complicated if we consider a work which appeared just 2 years after Binyon's Flight of the Dragon, in the very first years of the Chinese Republic. Published in Tokyo, the 1913 History of Chinese Painting by Nakamura Fusetsu and Kojika Seiyun was undeniably one of the most successful accounts of its subject in the first half of the 20th century. The Japanese edition was reprinted 6 times between 1913 and 1922, and throughout the 1920s it was extensively mined and plagiarized by Chinese authors, even before an official Chinese translation appeared in print in 1936. What perhaps hasn't been sufficiently noted is the fact that Nakamura Fusetsu, like Okakura Kakuzo, writing Ideals of the East in Calcutta, he had also undergone significant relocation in his own life. In 1901, already in his mid-30s, Nakamura went to Paris, where he studied under the painter Jean-Paul Laurence at the Académie Julian. The Académie Julian was very popular with a wide range of foreign art students in Paris, as it didn't have the rigorous entrance examinations of the official academy. It was essentially open to all who could pay. Roger Fry, the impresario of postmodernism, and the Canadian James Wilson Morris, whose work Jin Shaocheng saw in Paris in 1911, they also studied there. It had been the training ground for the first generation of Japanese oil painters, men, and they were all men at this point, who were highly influential as teachers in new institutions like the Tokyo School of Fine Arts. Nakamura studied also with a number of other French teachers, with Raphael Collin at the Académie Colarossi, as well as with Henri Royer and Gabriel Ferrier. These conservative figurative artists, with their academic style of erotic nudes, historic scenes, and Breton peasants, are scarcely household names today. But I need to suggest that there hasn't been sufficient acknowledgement of the fact that the man who wrote probably the most popular and widely used Japanese account of Chinese painting, an account which was then extensively reappropriated in China itself, painted works like this one, and he went on painting like this. Even as Nakamura Fusetsu was claiming that the gulf between Eastern and Western painting cannot be crossed, he was in his own person partly disproving that claim, painting in oils at the same time as he was enthusiastically collecting early Chinese calligraphy and reading writings on it by Kang Youwei, admirer of Raphael. So it surely has to matter exactly what sort of Western painting he had in mind as he wrote. This is the kind of complexity we need to account for if we want to move beyond simplistic binaries, finally move ourselves beyond concepts like influence, to understand flows and connections in a richer and ultimately more satisfying manner. Now, the gulf that Nakamura Fusetsu saw was diametrically opposed to the growing proximity visible to Jin Shaocheng, whose resort to the comparative mode to grasp what was in front of his eyes again underlines the way in which these sort of transnational comparisons between East and West were at this point being made in both directions. Japanese writers at exactly the same time were making the same point. In 1911, Nanga school painting, work like this, was being compared to the work of Gauguin, Cézanne, and Van Gogh, and one Tokyo School of Fine Arts professor was detecting an East Asian quality in the work of Cézanne, Gauguin, and Pierre Puvis de Chavannes. So Jin Shaocheng, in describing what he saw in Amsterdam and Paris as rather close to the Chinese manner of painting, is too well informed to totalize Western art as something which is ever the same and unchanging, and which is totally bound up in the accuracy of mimesis. Just as he understood the complex balancing acts of British parliamentary politics, or the issues at stake in a boxing match between a black American and a white American, he understood that modern painting, in Paris and in Amsterdam at least, was an art where expressiveness of brushwork and the manipulation of paint took precedence over the simple capturing of a likeness. As a man who was himself a keen photographer and who clearly sought out opportunities to look at photography and hear it talked about, he was well aware of the challenges posed over the course of the 19th century by a form of image making which could transmit the spirit just as, if not more effectively, than oil paint. For him, it is the increased visibility of brushwork and an allied coarseness and looseness in the handling of paint which is the main factor bringing new Western oil painting closer to Chinese work. He understands quite well that the teachers of Nakamura Fusetsu, soon to publish his history of Chinese painting, artists like Laurence or Collin, are no longer what new painting is all about. Jin Shaocheng may or may not have been aware of the history of Chinese painting penned by Hilbert Giles in 1905, which was during Jin's first stay in London, but he would have found nothing odd in Giles's claim that, quote, naturalism, impressionism, and plein airism, generally regarded as developments of the 19th century, were advocated by the Chinese at least 1,000 years before their appearance in Western salons. What we are seeing here is not, it seems to me, simply the, quote, meeting of Eastern and Western art, to borrow the title of the 1973 classic work by Michael Sullivan. Rather, it's the creation of a category of art which is Western and a category of art which is Chinese, but crucially, that creation takes place on both sides through an awareness of an engagement with the other term, and is not possible without it. For Jin Shaocheng, both of the identities which are coming into focus at this time, namely Western painting and Chinese painting, both have a history. Neither is timeless and unchanging. Jin's observation that the meticulously detailed gongbi, or fine brushwork, was the favored mode down to the Song period, to be succeeded by xieyi thereafter, is very much of a piece with a more broadly understood history which was circulating at this point between China, Japan, and the still very small cohort of Western writers who took an interest in such things. The idea of history, whether the history of painting or of a nation as having stages, is a prevalent part of the mentality of the late 19th century, and it's one which had a truly global reach. Note that Jin Shaocheng doesn't describe the move he perceives within Chinese painting from gongbi to xieyi as a history of decline from something good to something bad. Instead, he makes no value judgment as such. But within the broader framework of Orientalism in Europe and America, a story of decline was very much the way in which Chinese painting was being written about in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. It's an often told story how the first European encounters with Chinese picturing led initially only to disdain for what was seen as a whole series of lacks, of ability, of realism, of perspective, of colouring. This attitude, first formed in the early modern period by theorists like the German Joachim von Sandrart, was still very much alive into the 19th century. In 1886, William Anderson published his descriptive and historical catalogue of a collection of Chinese and Japanese paintings in the British Museum, listing the works of both traditions which he'd acquired during a long residence in Japan. He never actually visited China, and which he presented to the museum. His knowledge of Chinese painting is therefore very much one which is refracted through a 19th century Japanese lens. For Anderson, the main features of Chinese art may be summed up as follows, and he goes on to condemn defect of drawing, lack of intelligent observation, and a drifting into evil ways. These ideas derive ultimately from the American Ernest Fenollosa, mentor of the same Okakura Kakuzo, from whom the Anglophone world first gained awareness of the 6 laws of Xie, and someone who despised the literati tradition of painting. But this framework was to be largely abandoned by Western writers, people like Lawrence Binyon, in the early 20th century, a period of increasingly complex entanglements. This was, to be sure, a time when those great entities of East and West formed the indispensable framework for almost all discussion of anything by everybody. But if we look at the way in which ideas about the modernity of non-mimetic art pinged back and forward across the globe, what we are seeing is a sort of echo chamber. In 1918, the daily newspaper of Peking University began its serialization of a Chinese translation of one of the most influential of all Western works on Chinese painting. Its version of Stephen Bushell's 1908 Chinese Art appeared in the paper in a number of installments, very much under the patronage of one of the truly towering figures of the new culture movement, the university's chancellor, Tsai Yuan-pei, who edited and proofread the translation. And he also provided an important series of notes and comments in which he reinterprets the interpretation of Bushell back into a form more meaningful for a Chinese audience. His notes are a mixture of exasperation and patient explanation, as he tries to make Bushell make sense for Chinese readers. Not surprisingly, one of the longest notes in the whole text is his gloss on Bushell's explanation of Xie He's 6 laws of painting. In the 1908 text, Chinese Art, when he comes to discuss the ideas of Xie He, Bushell simply follows Lawrence Binyon exactly. Lawrence Binyon, who in fact is simply quoting Okakura here, had written regarding Xie He, his first law is that of rhythmic vitality, the life movements of the spirit through the rhythm of things. Now, of course, in translating this into Chinese, rhythmic vitality is simply rendered back directly into Xie He's original, the enigmatic Qi Yun Sheng Dong. Now, Cai Yuanpei begins at once by stating that the phrase is, in truth, difficult to explain, although he admits that many writers over time have done so. According to him, the Chinese writer who explains it most penetratingly is the early 17th century author on art, Tang Zhiqi. Tang Zhiqi, as quoted by Cai Yuanpei, has this to say about the third character of the phrase, about sheng, about life. That which is life is endless generation and regeneration, deep and vast and inexhaustible, mobile and not static. It receives humanity with vitality. Now, the phrase endless generation and regeneration is the crucial wording here. And in order to understand why, it's necessary to step back and pick up a train of thought developed earlier, to do with the hugely influential ideas of Henri Bergson, philosopher of life and life force. His great influence in Europe was matched by the global reach of his thought, the first explicit Chinese exposition of which appears in a magazine article published in 1913. Someone as culturally attuned as Cai Yuanpei was certainly aware of at least the broad outlines of Bergson's ideas when he worked in 1918 on his comments on Bushell's Chinese art. As for the broad current of ideas under the label of vitalism, part of the attraction which these had for Chinese intellectuals at this time was the possibility of linking it to indigenous patterns of thought, and thereby demonstrating that these supposedly advanced ideas so praised in the West were in fact ideas which had already existed within Chinese thought and culture for many centuries, if not millennia. The ideas of Henri Bergson and of the then globally famous, if now much less well-remembered, German scientist and philosopher of vitalism, Hans Driesch, these were used by Chinese intellectuals to argue for the existence in China of an ancient, but still viable and usable, and above all, intrinsically Chinese understanding of a ceaselessly generative power of life that was thought to penetrate the cosmos. Bergson's central idea that the development of life constituted a perpetual change of form, one in which reality was a constant flow of changes, this could scarcely fail to attract attention in China, for its apparent confirmation of some already very ancient ideas in China. In China, the existence of a purely domestic tradition of vitalism was supposedly first seen in the earliest of all Confucian classics, the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, in formulations like Sheng Sheng Bu Xi, endless generation and regeneration. This in turn enabled Chinese thinkers to construct vitalism, seen crucially now as non-mechanistic and spiritual, as a key part of the Chinese tradition. And in 1922, Hans Driesch himself visited China, where he spent a year lecturing on vitalism. Making the topic one hotly debated by a range of Chinese thinkers and writers across the early republic's complex and vital intellectual terrain, as it was across Europe too. We are dealing, therefore, with a point in time when a Chinese intellectual who had studied extensively in Germany, he had a Leipzig PhD, when he might cite a Ming Dynasty source from the early 17th century in order to bring a contemporary French philosopher to bear on the Chinese translation of a commentary written in English in India by a Japanese writer as cited by a British author. To invoke, therefore, the idea of the transnational, or at the very least to refuse to be bounded entirely by a sense of separateness, is simply to acknowledge the actual contexts in which actual artworks, and even more, the ideas about them, were at this point in history enmeshed. Pictures, in the age in which imperialism and mechanical reproduction intersected most fully, pictures were certainly moving around the globe with almost the same facility as ideas. It's only that there is much more reciprocity in the circulation of the latter, of the ideas, and the flows are therefore much more complex and hard to pin down. But one thing is for sure, East isn't East, West is not West. And it's not so much a question of these two historically operative notions meeting as of them being inextricable at their point of creation in the first place. This, I think, we can see very clearly in an important 1921 essay entitled The Value of Literati Painting by the painter and critic Chen Shizheng, who was also the author in the following year of A History of Chinese Painting, which drew extensively on the 1913 work of the same name by the Paris-trained Nakamura Fusetsu. Chen's own student years in Japan coincided with a move there to take much more seriously the literati painting, especially the later literati painting, which Ernest Fenollosa dismissed so curtly, and which Kang Youwei had compared so poorly to Raphael. Chen was certainly in Japan when the critic Saito Yori came back from Paris in 1908 and introduced the work of Matisse and Gauguin, seen by him both at the Salon d'Automne and at the home of the American collectors Leo and Gertrude Stein. It's perfectly possible that Chen Shizheng read at this time, or even discussed with its authors, the growing Japanese literature on the art of Paul Cézanne, with its strong emphasis on the expression of the artist's personality through brushwork and its invocation even of the centrality of rhythm to its effects. As early as 1911, Chen translated a Japanese essay on the current state of painting in Europe, so he was clearly up to speed with current trends in art, at least as they were being discussed in Tokyo. This matters because it's the formation which underlies his famous polemic on the value of literati painting, first published in the spring of 1921. Now, to step back a minute, the term literati painting, Wenren Hua, was itself ancient, referring in its origin to the kind of art produced and favored by a social elite of educated men. But its use as a stylistic label was more of a novelty. Some of that novelty can be seen in the fact that the term literati painting, Wenren Hua, doesn't appear at all in the main Shanghai newspaper Shenbao until March 1923, 2 years after Chen's plea for its value. Chen would have been appreciative of the statement by Lawrence Binyon made 10 years earlier, I've already quoted it, that the theory that art is above all things imitative and representative no longer holds the field with thinking minds. Now, Binyon in 1911 will have been thinking of events like the famous post-impressionist exhibition, organized by his contemporary Roger Fry, a show which Binyon himself reviewed in the London Art Press. But remember that Jin Shaocheng had already been well aware of the turn away from mimesis in new Western art at that very same moment, a good 10 years before the value of literati painting, when he had made the comparison between the painting he saw in Paris in 1911 and the brushwork of two 17th century Chinese artists, Shi Tao and Bada Shanren. Although Jin hadn't used the names of specific schools of art, the broad outlines of the shift going on in front of his eyes were perfectly clear to him. This is the context in which we need to read a famous passage from the essay, The Value of Literati Painting, in which Chen Shizeng, some 10 years after Jin Shaocheng visited that Paris exhibition, he uses his own recognition of new development in Western art, much of it learned in Japan, to claim a modernity for his own practice and that of his immediate Chinese contemporaries. In the 1921 vernacular version, he puts it like this: "The painting of Westerners emphasizes form-likeness to an extreme degree. But now the painting of the new schools has completely smashed the old rules, and the so-called futurist school and cubist school, what do they resemble?" In 1922, a revised and expanded classical Chinese version of the passage adds more detail, and I should say that my translation here is a slightly modified version of that originally made by Ida Yuan Wong. Western painting can be described as extremely faithful to form. Since the 19th century, in accordance with the principles of science, Western painting has meticulously rendered objects with light and colors. Lately, however, post-impressionism has run counter to that course. It de-emphasizes the objective and focuses on the subjective. Cubism, Futurism, and Expressionism have successfully taken the stage, their intellectual transformations being sufficient demonstration that verisimilitude does not exhaust the good in art, and that alternative criteria must be sought. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to think about what the terms Cubism, Futurism, and Expressionism meant to Chen Shizeng and his readers. What was at stake for him in invoking these Western modernist movements as part of his argument for the defense of a Chinese art which he, like Binyon, saw as essentially non-mimetic? These are by and large terms formed in Japan in the pre-1914 years, the years Chen spent there as a student. They were terms which by the early 1920s at the very latest, an educated person in China, or at least one with a passing interest in the arts, might be expected to know about. And note that Chen doesn't feel any need to explain them. He assumes that his readers will get the point. The foreign language press, the English language press in China, was certainly well aware of such developments. For example, on the 1st of April 1914, the Peking Daily News carried an account reprinted directly from the London Times of that year's Paris Salon des Indépendants, an exhibition including work by Archipenko, Malevich, and both Sonia Delaunay and her husband Robert, art which revealed the untrammeled imagination of cubists and futurists. In 1916, Bernard Leach, who would go on to become famous as the father of British studio pottery, but who was in Beijing at this time and describes himself simply as a modern painter resident in the East, he published in the Peking Gazette a review of an exhibition of Chinese and European painting held to raise relief funds during wartime. In addition to asserting that, quote, rhythm plays a dominant part in both modern Western and Chinese painting, he makes yet again the point that there has been a recent convergence, the term he uses is parallelism, between them, in a shared turn away from, quote, a slavish imitation of the outside of nature. This leads him to reflect that in recent years, quote, art, grown sick of photographic servility, breaks ruthlessly all the academic rules and sets about self-expression under labels of post-impressionism, cubism, futurism, and so forth. Only a few years later, these same terms were ones which anyone might read in the Chinese language newspapers or in any number of journals of the day. For example, by 1919, an essay by the famous writer Lu Xun talks of the post-impressionism associated with the names of Cézanne and Van Gogh as being already outmoded, superseded by cubism and futurism. In the same year, the precociously talented Liu Haisu was being described in the newspaper account of another Shanghai art exhibition as belonging to the Weilai Pai, the futurist school. Now, this term, in fact, has a very wide reach in early Republican discourse, and a search for it in the newspaper Shenbao turns up numerous instances which have little or nothing to do with the Italian artistic movement founded in 1909 by Marinetti. But Marinetti's manifesto was translated into Japanese in that selfsame year and was potentially available to a Chinese audience too. Whether Liu Haisu was or was not a futurist in the strict sense, and he certainly was not, is less important than that he was identified as such to the readers of Shenbao. The same sort of trajectory can be identified with regard to awareness of Cubism. In March 1920, the newspaper published a photograph with a caption reporting the visit to Beijing of the Belgian Cubist painter Guy d'Archamps. Now, this would appear to be Alphonse Ketz, who was hired by Tsai Yuanpei, already mentioned as Chancellor of Peking University, to teach oil painting there. The anonymous journalist records of him that the gentleman is a painter of the Cubist school. He is a most amiable person, and personalities of our nation take pleasures in associating with him. Again, whether the somewhat shadowy Ketz was or was not a Cubist, and it seems extremely unlikely, is less important than that he was called one in print. The third of Chun's new schools, that of Expressionism, is mentioned in the intriguing account published in September 1922 of a Beijing exhibition of reproductions of Western paintings, mounted on his return from Paris by Chen Xiaojiang, a somewhat shadowy painter about whom it's not possible to discover much firm information at the moment. This exhibition is said to have included, quote, famous expressionist painters of the 19th century, and the article specifies among them Monet as well as Cézanne. There's much more in the value of literati painting, which can be read as an engagement in what are essentially transnational conversations. The opposition in its opening paragraph between the living and the mechanical is an intervention in the debates on vitalism, on the thought of Henri Bergson, among others, which raged at this time. Above all, there is a quintessentially early 20th century devotion to progress in Chen Xiaozheng's central argument that the fact that literati painting does not seek out verisimilitude is what makes that painting progressive. Chun's position that verisimilitude is something which a mature art will grow out of is strikingly parallel to Binyon's statement that the theory that art is above all things imitative and representative no longer holds the field with thinking minds. Both share an implicit commitment to ideas of progress and of evolution, which have their ultimate source in Darwin, or rather in his adaptation by Herbert Spencer, prophet of the rhythm which Okakura was the first to find in the 6 laws of Xie. And their understandings of the sources of that desired transcendence of mere appearance are also similar. It would be immediately obvious to anyone reading Chen Xiaozheng's polemic that in evoking verisimilitude, and the Chinese word he uses is 心色, invoking this verisimilitude as the quality which used to dominate Western art in the past, but which has now been abandoned by its most advanced practitioners, the author is implicitly quoting from nothing less than those 6 laws of Xie, the ultimate source of this term, and the basis on which both Chen and Binyon ground their understanding. Although Chen mentions Xie and the 6 laws directly as valuing qiyun above all, he in fact cites this term only once by comparison with the many times he wrestles with its conceptual opposite, 心色, form likeness, or verisimilitude, or mimesis. But once is enough. When he talks about the need to find alternative criteria to verisimilitude, those alternative criteria were for Chen to hand in the huge body of painting theory, and above all, in those later interpretations of the 6 laws of Xie, which, far from seeing them as 6 laws the painter had to be equally good at, saw them clearly as a hierarchy. The materiality of those alternative criteria was equally to hand in the practice of painting across China's last 500 years. The Ming and Qing painting, which it was possible you could actually see and not just read about in books. And crucially, it was to hand in the modern art by painters such as Chen himself, for whom those non-mimetic criteria were still highly pertinent and meaningful. Thus, at the precise point that Chinese thinkers were drawing a contrast between vital East and static dead West, Chen was demonstrating that the latter's new interest in non-representational art merely brought it up to speed with where China had been for centuries, and thereby he was implicitly challenging Eurocentric notions of artistic progress. But crucially, he was doing so through an awareness of modern Western practice and indeed Western debates. He argued from understanding and not from lack of awareness, and this is important. This is why it's difficult to agree with the art historian Michael Sullivan's use of a term like Beijing conservatism to characterize the artistic practice of such as Jin Shaocheng and Chen Shizeng at this time. To quote Bruno Latour, one is not born traditional. One chooses to become traditional by constant innovation. The idea of an identical repetition of the past and that of a radical rupture with any past are two symmetrical results of a single conception of time. We have never moved either forward or backward. We have always actively sorted out elements belonging to different times. We can still sort. It is the sorting that makes the times, not the times that make the sorting. End quote. One of the forms of sorting we've all learned to be most alert for is the process of othering, the making of them and us. Art history has had plenty of complicity in this, and I don't want to downplay the ways in which the creation of categories like Chinese art and Western art are part of a process of such reductive labelings, with consequences we are only too familiar with. But I want to suggest that there are, if we pay attention to actual historical actors, moments of almost utopian saming, of reaching out to say, we are not different. And I want to suggest that just such a utopian possibility was briefly opened up in the early 20th century, when certain Chinese thinkers actually looked hard at art that was new and art that was old, without jumping to explain the difference that they had not yet learned to take as self-evident. The literati painting of the early 20th century moment, and it's necessary to stress again the newness, or rather at the very least the renewal of this term at this time. This was, as Ida Wong has shown, in essence a transnational creation, or at the very least one which depended on the transnational circulation of both images and ideas about images. We see this clearly when Takiseiichi, editor of the premier Japanese art history journal Kokka, when he writes in 1922 on literati painting and expressionism, citing the Italian philosopher of aesthetics Benedetto Croce on how imitation is not art, and citing too the Russian painter and theorist Vasily Kandinsky, author of Concerning the Spiritual in Art, published in 1911 on innerer Klang, inner sounding, a notion which Kandinsky associated above all with the East, even if he was a bit vague as to the specifics of where the East was. Kandinsky's ideas were first introduced to Japanese readers in 1912, and hence were almost certainly known to Chen Shizeng by the time he wrote on the value of literati painting in that same year of 1922. But perhaps we need to recall that Kandinsky's English translator, Michael Sadler, was not only a close friend and correspondent of Lawrence Binyon, he's also on record as noting Kandinsky's, quote, deep respect and admiration for Chinese art. Exactly which aspects of Chinese art attracted Kandinsky, we do not know, and it's worth bearing in mind that they may in fact have been related to actual objects which are about as far removed as it's possible to imagine from literati painting. We know that Kandinsky's close friend and collaborator in the Blue Rider project, the painter Franz Marc, was an enthusiastic collector of the highly colored Chinese images of animals and figures known in English as pith paper paintings or rice paper paintings, a sort of early tourist art. And indeed, one of these was actually reproduced in the Blue Rider Almanac, which Kandinsky and Marc had produced together in 1912. But whatever Chinese art someone like Kandinsky saw, it will most likely have been mediated for him by Western writers on Chinese art, even perhaps by the writings of people like Binyan, for whom, as we have seen, the 6 laws, and above all, Qiyun Shengdong, which he understood as rhythmic vitality, loomed so large as the key to an understanding of Chinese aesthetics. Tracing the paths of circulation and recirculation here isn't easy. However, in trying to do so, we have to think about histories which are not just about what happened in Beijing or Kyoto or Munich or Paris, but which give a place to all these and other locations simultaneously. It's now more than 30 years since Bruno Latour polemically argued that we have never been modern, that modernity is much more than an illusion and much less than an essence. That may be so, but as the moment when the modernity of Chinese art was possible, as this came to be forgotten in the 20th century, when it all became traditional in the face of more obviously presented modernities, the power of that illusion pushed all sorts of things to the margins. And it's taking art history more effort than might be imagined to recuperate them. Thank you very much.